West.
Well, earlier I was joined by European law professor Francesco Rizzuto. He said David Davis' comments were a warning to the government.
My sense is that this is an attempted preemptive strike. I think that the chances of there not being an agreement are fairly remote. So he's basically telling the government, you may get an agreement, but it's not going to get through the House.
Well, we'll come back to that comment a bit later. But in the meantime, Dominic Raab says we're 3 weeks away. But the government, meanwhile, is backtracking on that time frame. What's your hunch on this?
I think there will be an agreement because if there isn't an agreement by the end of November or at the latest early December, then I think everybody's parliamentary timetable will be in the dustbin, basically. And in order to get the legislation through by March will be extraordinary. But remember, it's not just in the UK that this has to be got through. It also has to be accepted by the European Parliament and eventually the other parliaments of the 20. Remember, we have an agreement, and that means that for 2 years it's status quo. In other words, nothing will change other than the fact that we won't be represented in the institutions. We won't be lawmakers, we'll be law takers. The argument now is what happens after then, and essentially what we're trying to do is to extend that period so that Ireland doesn't end up with a physical frontier.
Also then, let's look back to what's been happening over the last few days. The budget itself, the Chancellor set aside £500 million for a no-deal planning. I mean, therefore, isn't it all in hand? It's all safe, isn't it?
Is it? Sorry to be a little bit cynical. I think the really significant thing about the budget is not so much the money that's been set aside, and we really haven't discussed how much money we've already spent. I think the really significant aspect of the budget is the fact that the budget, which is essentially a set of promises for the future, depend on us getting a deal.
And what about David Davis as interim Brexit Prime Minister if May's forced out? I mean, do you think he'd get a better deal?
No. I think that if the hard Brexiteers and the Conservative Party and Labour and the opposition vote a deal down, there will have to be an election. It's simply inconceivable in a modern democracy that the key policy of the government is voted down, not only by the opposition, but part of its own support. The government can't continue, frankly. So I don't actually see Mrs May resigning and Boris or David Davis, this is some of the stuff that the newspapers are peddling around, is conceivable. I think it really would be an affront to democracy.
Well, all this comes as the Edenbridge Bonfire Society has chosen its latest personality to turn into a giant guide to burn on the 3rd of November. In previous years, it's picked Donald Trump, Wayne Rooney and Katie Hopkins. And this year's his feet like the ones he travelled in during the referendum campaign. He's also having his Brexit cake and eating it, but instead of cherries, bike helmet. Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has expressed shock over the latest information to emerge in the murder case of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The dissident journalist was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd. Riyadh claims he was murdered as a result of a fight with rogue staff members. But now Istanbul's chief prosecutor says Khashoggi was strangled as soon as he entered the building. His body was then dismembered and disposed of. Despite international condemnation and pressure, Jeremy Hunt says the UK can't afford to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia. RT's Anastasia Cherkina has the story.
The Khashoggi murder may be, quote, completely contrary to British values, but it doesn't look likely that this will be affecting the trade relationship between the UK and its longtime ally Saudi Arabia anytime soon, despite the renewed criticism of this trade relationship with the UK selling weapons to the Saudi regime having been renewed following this latest Khashoggi scandal.
I think one of the issues is that there are some countries which have very good human rights record
that would end up being very insulted if we said to them that we're only prepared to sign a trade deal with you if you agree to a human rights clause. And I think there is a particular issue that because of Brexit, we are going to be aiming to sign trade deals with everyone at the moment.
Well, there we have it. UK Foreign Secretary saying that trade relationships with everybody are going to be continuing, especially in light of Brexit. But this issue of the UK support of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has been at the forefront this week. They also saw the Middle East Minister Alistair Burt appear in Parliament, where he was also questioned about the trade relationship between the UK and Saudi Arabia, and he also insisted that this relationship is something that does not affect the dire situation with the conflict on the ground.
The only thing that we don't do is actually press the button to drop the bomb. Arms supplies are there for those who need to defend themselves.
The amount of raids targeting the civilians has gone up, not down. If these are all errors, there seem to be an awful lot of them.
Well, the UK government continues to be insistent that there's no link between the Khashoggi murder and its involvement with the Saudi-led coalition in the war in Yemen, which, as we know now, has led to the deaths of as many as 56,000 people, making it all the more shocking to hear that UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt was saying in Westminster that it's necessary to wait and see what kind of investigation results are going to come out of the Khashoggi case. And he also said that it's important to see how Saudi Arabia will react and potentially promise to not act similarly moving forward in the future.
After the break, Grenfell Tower survivors are told they could be moved onto the controversial Universal Credit Scheme just days before Christmas. I'll be talking to campaigner Professor Chris Imafidon.
Come into my room and he just makes me do things I just don't want to do. Sometimes scared.
Over 500,000 children suffer abuse and neglect a year in the UK. But there is something we can all do. Please leave a gift in your will to the NSPCC and help be there for every child. Become a guardian for future generations. Search NSPCC Guardians to request your free legacy information pack.
Welcome back. Survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire could be plunged into financial chaos just days before Christmas. Benefits claimants who survived the blaze in June last year will be put onto the new Universal Credit Scheme from December the 12th. The welfare system rolls 6 benefits into a single payment, but has been criticised for delays which have left some facing hardship. In Monday's budget, Chancellor Philip Hammond pledged £1.7 billion to help fix the problems. But the Department for Work and Pensions says there's nothing new in the plans.
Following last year's events, DWP Job Centre staff handled people's claims with sensitivity and flexibility, and extra support was put in place for anyone who needed it, including applying exceptional circumstances rules to protect benefit payments for affected residents. The timetable for universal credit rollout has been available for some time, and is on track for completion in December 2018.
Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Grenfell campaigner Professor Chris Imafidon. Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. But we've heard the quote there. This has been rolled out for some time, the idea of the planning here. So what's the problem? Everybody knew it was coming.
Under normal circumstances, there shouldn't be any problem. If you asked me this time last year, I would have said by now the accommodation would have been settled. People would have started their life all over again. But on Monday, we're told about the pollution that we have in the area, the soil contaminated. On Tuesday, they're doing a different consultation on the green paper. Things are not normal. If they are not normal, we make room. That's what flexibility is for. We accommodate. The most vulnerable in the society should at least have our consideration. That's the index of a civilized society. How do you treat the least privileged or the most vulnerable? In this case, we seem to have just thrown everything out of the window and say there's something magical about the 12th of December. There isn't anything magical about the 12th of December. We have to look at people that are still in pain, people that are still grieving. The hearing is still on. So they don't have no one in that area has a normal life. So don't apply so-called non-normal conditions to them.
Not normal conditions, but looking on the positives, if you can take some, on Monday, Philip Hammond put another £1 billion into the system to help sort out teething problems. So surely that's a good sign, yes?
We heard that in the news. We're yet to see the real impact on that. So we have to give it time to it to filter through and really see whether that is seen on the ground. Because right now in Grenfell, what we see on the ground is contaminated soil and people still living in bread and breakfast. There are still human beings after more than 18 months whose houses were burnt down, not by their own fault, not for what offense they committed. Why can't we accommodate that? I find that incredible.
Well, if there is a positive to come from this, is looking at some of the pictures there now, Grenfell remains pretty much in the public conscience. It still is. So in that sense, there can't be any mistakes, can there? They can't possibly mess up. They're putting more money in. The DWP says it's going to be okay. Going forward, there are positive signs.
They just apologized 48 hours ago, saying that we didn't know, we didn't test for certain substances in the air. We didn't know, we didn't do this. We didn't know. It's an ongoing saga. And quite honestly, the victims will want to have a break from it all. And so there are no more mistakes. Let's just come back to our normal life and do what every other person is doing. Everyone wants a return to normalcy. The entire community has been traumatized, been grieving. You still see this whole thing. I keep making reference to the inquiry going on. That means we don't even know, we've not gotten to the bottom of what happened, why it happened, and how it happened. We don't know that yet. And we're doing as if, let's just brush that aside, as if there were no lives that were lost. I keep saying this. If humans understand that if you lose a pair of shoes, you can get a replacement from the shop. If you lose your clothes, you can buy anything. But if you lose a life, it takes a long time for the widows to recover from their grieving, from their grieving. And I really think we should be at least sensitive to the conditions and what the current victims are going through.
If I can just bring it back to the benefit issue then, which is the key point at the moment. How many people are we actually talking about here in terms of the benefit system, how that will affect? Because many of the Grenfell survivors, they had jobs, many of them had 2 or 3 jobs. So is it a case of, with all these changes, and we were highlighting this emotive story just before Christmas, I mean, is it just a few people, though, who are Grenfell survivors who are actually on benefits?
That's a big question. I'll be shocked if it's more than about a dozen.
Right.
So why can't, it's so small, it's so insignificant, why can't we make the exception for them? That's essentially what I'm saying. Because you cannot tell me that 50% of the survivors are affected. It's just a few people that are affected, the most vulnerable, should be left. I mean, I really feel they should be left alone.
Professor Chris Imafidon, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, 15 environmental activists have been arrested outside Parliament as 1,000 people staged a protest to get the government to act on climate change. The organisers group Extinct Rebellion say the event is part of a campaign of civil disobedience set to last until midnight.